Shana Tova. Before I start, I just want to make sure, can everyone hear me okay in the back? Okay, and online? Okay. All right. So, it's been a hard year for all of us who love Israel. And glad Rabbi Ezra told us he took off his watch this morning because I have a lot to say about this one. It's been hard, really hard, watching from afar as Israel has been sucked into turmoil. It's also been hard watching nearby as so many American Jews are giving up on Israel. Some rabbis, my colleagues, who already for years have been feeling really distant, have started declaring the Zionist project dead, God forbid, and taking this moment of political strife to validate an apathy or antipathy that's been there for a while. So I'm here to ask of you today, don't give up on Israel. We can grapple with our ties with the Jewish state. We can criticize, we can feel anger, we can feel disappointment, but we cannot cut Israel out of Judaism without shredding the fabric of our religion and our people. So this morning, I have two things I want to do. I want to remind us how and why Israel has always been an integral part of the Jewish story and why especially the state of Israel today is so essential. And second, I will offer an alternative narrative to the anger and disappointment that so many of us are feeling. Rather than seeing this moment as the end of a dream, I see it as the continuation of a historic process and a moment of great hope. So let's begin by digging back into that historic process and remembering what Judaism was like when there was no Jewish state. I want to take you back 100 years to Warsaw, Poland, and offer up the story of one family from among many stories that are here in this room. One story that illustrates the deep ties between diaspora Jews and the state of Israel. The story I offer today is that of my own maternal grandmother. When I knew my grandma, she was a tiny woman who took up twice as much space as anyone else in the room. She could be harsh, even cruel, especially to those of us she loved, and she loved us fiercely. And her stories of her life, the ones that she told us, shape who I am. My powerful grandma started out life as the youngest of 7 children. Dov Ber, Masha, Yechiel, Akiva, Malka, Yisrael, and my grandmother, Sarah Rachel. I won't test you, but some of these names are going to come back. Their father was a Hasidic Rabbi, a spiritual leader in Warsaw with a small community of Hasidim who looked to him for guidance. He was actually the third in a dynastic line of rabbis. His wife was a Rebbitzin. And every Shabbat afternoon, their home would fill with the Hasidim thumping on the table and singing. The women and girls would hang out in the kitchen and pass cakes and drinks out to the men. One Shabbat morning, my grandmother hid under the dining room table where the guys were singing. And as the men's voice rose to a crescendo, she jumped out, put on a tallis, and added her voice to theirs. Her uncle chewed her out and sent her scurrying. After that, Akiva, the middle child of 7, sweet Akiva, would sometimes stay with my grandmother on Shabbat afternoons and give her pony rides on his back. Once a friend of Dov Ber's, the eldest, fell sick and was hospitalized. To visit him on Shabbat, when it's forbidden to ride the bus, he took a long walk through unfamiliar neighborhoods, and on the way, he was attacked by a gang of anti-Semitic thugs who roughed him up and pulled out chunks of his beard. There were other such incidents throughout the Jewish community, as we all know, and money was always short. So when my great-grandfather received an offer to serve as the rabbi of a synagogue in Brooklyn, he accepted. But it was an expensive and dangerous gamble, and he and the Rebbitzin left all of their children in Europe. Well, the older four were already independent, but the youngest three, Malka, Yisrael, my grandmother, they were given over to the care of their older sister, Masha, already married, soon pregnant, totally unequipped to care for them. That was the desperation of that generation, a desperation that many people in other parts of the world still feel today. This price and much more they are willing to pay to come to America. From the way my grandmother talked about that time and from the intensity of her attachment issues throughout the rest of her life, I am convinced that that period of abandonment by her mother scarred my grandmother for life. And I know many of you have similar stories in your families. It was several years before my great-grandparents sent for the three youngest to join them in New York City. Meanwhile, while all of this family drama was playing out, a bigger drama was sweeping through the communities of Eastern Europe: Zionism. New enlightened leaders proclaimed it was time to stop tolerating the bullies who pulled out beards and taunted us on street corners and much worse. These Jewish leaders, who usually did not have beards themselves, demanded we could wait no longer for the Mashiach, for the Messiah. It was time to rise up and reclaim our land. Most rabbis looked askance at this new ideology. Some embraced it. My great-grandfather had apparently remained neutral on the topic of Zionism, but his adult children became fired up with the hope of Jewish empowerment. The older four who had remained in Warsaw applied for visas to get into Palestine. After a long waiting period, wonderful news. The visas were granted for Dov Ber and his wife, Masha and her husband, and their young son, Yechiel and Akiva. And there was only one problem. Dov Ber had a son now too. They were short one visa. So Akiva gave up his visa to Dov Ber's son. I think he then applied for a new one for himself. It was too late. My grandmother never saw sweet Akiva again. For the rest of her life, whenever she told us Akiva stories, she always added, Hitler got him. That's what was at stake. In her first years in New York City, my grandmother had to sit in a classroom with much younger children as she learned English. She changed her name from Sarah Rachel to Sarah. Her brother Yisrael became Irving. And Malka, the third sibling who had traveled with them to New York, as soon as she could, she left to join the older three in the Holy Land. There she found a very different set of hardships: hunger, minimal infrastructure. The land was being settled by scholars and bankers and journalists, people who had come equipped with nothing but their idealism to help them farm the land and defend themselves. They were the Chalutzim, Israel's pioneers, and truly, in my mind, the greatest generation. The bravery it must have taken to leave that close-knit world and cross thousands of miles to an unfamiliar land, it boggles the mind. For nearly 2,000 years, we Jews have been praying to return to Israel. There is hardly a page of the prayer book that doesn't mention the land. It is the promised land, the symbol of all our hope for a better future, but it was a symbol, not an agenda. The shift in mindset to actually make it happen with our own hands was enormous. So let's look at one of those prayers, recited every morning just before the Shema. If you were here at 9 a.m., you said it today too. V'avienu l'shalom me'arba kanfot ha'aretz v'tolichenu komumiyut le'artzenu ki el po'el yeshuot ata. Bring us safely from the four corners of the earth. Lead us in dignity to our land, for you are the God who effects deliverance. Notice how passive that language is. Bring us, lead us, you effect deliverance. I am certain that my great-grandfather, the Rabbi, prayed those words fervently every day of his life, asking God to bring all of us to Israel. It was one thing to pray to God for deliverance. It was an entirely different matter to pick up pen and plow and rifle and attempt to repossess the land for ourselves. When it came down to taking action, he chose Brooklyn. His 5 oldest children chose Israel. And in doing so, they were attempting to overturn 2,000 years of disempowerment. My grandmother felt the pull of that idealism. She was also proud of her success in America. Her English became fluent, no hint of a Yiddish accent. She gave her children utterly American names: Manny, my mother Evie, and later Marty. My mother and her brothers were so American, they were even picky eaters. Manny in particular hated eggs. And then when Manny was 5 years old and my mother was 3, another abandonment. My grandfather died of a neurodegenerative disease. My grandmother, a young mother and now a young widow, was lost. She turned her eyes to the symbol of Jewish hope and decided to make Aliyah with her 2 children. Her brothers and sisters welcomed her. They gave her a place to stay. They shared their minimal resources. But my grandmother and her children were already softened by America. They were hungry and there was nothing to eat. Little Manny, who hated eggs, couldn't understand why his mother wasn't feeding him. And he cried, "But I do want an egg! I do want an egg!" And at that moment, my grandmother gave up on Aliyah. She purchased the return passage to New York and she soon remarried. Many years later, when I was in the 5th or 6th grade, I read somewhere that Israel was classified as a third world country. I was befuddled. To me, Israel was a place of abundance. Arctic popsicles, Beasley barbecue flavored snacks, Milky, those plastic containers with chocolate pudding and whipped cream right there. Israel was fun and food and comfort. True, my Israeli cousins lived in small apartments and we lived in a 2-story home. My parents owned 2 automatic shift cars, and my cousins drove tiny manual shifts, those who had a car at all, but no one was hungry. It was not a place of poverty. Israel had come a very long way between my mother's childhood and mine. The progress made in 1 generation felt nothing short of miraculous. And the idealism was strong. The kibbutz movement was thriving. Much of the broader economy operated on socialist norms. A feeling of shared purpose united the country. Israel has come a long way again between my childhood and my children's. The stick shift cars have nearly disappeared. So have those empty lots studded with thistles and sour grass. They've been replaced by sleek modern buildings. The spirit of socialism has been supplanted by a spirit of capitalism. Out of the ingenuity of the 1930s and 40s that made the desert bloom has burst forth an entrepreneurial culture in which hundreds, literally hundreds, of startup companies emerge every year. The pace of Israel's material success is breathtaking. It's exhilarating. And at the same time, the greatest generation is leaving us. And sadly, perhaps unavoidably, the idealism that drove Israel's founders seems to many to be fading in the rearview mirror. Emblematic of the Israel of my childhood is that famous photo from 1967 in the Six-Day War. Tough-looking soldiers in camouflage and helmets with their heads against the ancient stones of the Kotel, weeping. Growing up, I felt so clearly, so irreproachably our right to that land, to those stones. I felt such pride in our accomplishments. My own hands had contributed nothing, but these were my people, and we had made this scrappy little nation into a powerhouse. But along with reunification of Jerusalem, we also got Sinai and the Golan and Gaza and the entire west bank of the Jordan River known as Judea and Samaria. The West Bank is the heartland of our Tanakh, Shiloh, where the tabernacle rested until King David moved it to Jerusalem. Jericho, the first city that Joshua captured in a miracle of crumbling walls. Hebron, the burial site that Abraham bought for Sarah. Our people have a deep connection to that part of the land. So did the roughly 1 million not-Jewish people who, as of 1967, had been living there for centuries and knew of no other home. It's been 56 years since Israel gained control of the West Bank. 56 years of conflict that has left tens of thousands dead. I want to share with you an excerpt from a speech by David Grossman, a novelist who writes with great emotional depth about Israeli culture and especially about the pain of the Arab-Israeli conflict. He lost one of his own children, Uri, in 1997 in the war in Lebanon, a war that was the antithesis of the Six-Day War. So protracted, it sapped Israeli confidence and idealism. He gave this speech in 2018, 21 years after he lost his son. And even after all that time, he describes the absence of his son in his life as a terrible no. Here are his words. It hurts beyond description to stand opposite that definitive no. There are moments when the no draws in all that exists and all the yeses. It is hard to separate the memory from the pain, so it hurts to remember, but it is more frightening to forget. Pain like that can erode a soul of a person and of a nation. So too does living in constant fear. Nothing is as powerfully undermining as a threat to your physical safety. When you know there are people not far away who want to kill you, it shapes the way you think and feel and act. I want to share with you an excerpt from a recent interview with Daniel Hartman, co-president of the Hartman Institute. Here's what Hartman said. Liberal Zionism in Israel recognizes that we don't want to be an occupier of another people. But it's very hard to even have a conversation about Palestinian rights in Israel when you know you're talking about a society that wants to kill you. Israelis have suffered in this decades-long conflict from loss, from fear, and from something else. Awareness of the suffering of the Palestinian people has also hurt the Israeli psyche. Young people being required to enforce restrictive laws, sometimes forced to defend themselves with violence, being perceived rightly or wrongly as oppressing another people, that has all caused a slow, insidious seeping of will. David Grossman believes that this situation has led to a deep alienation among secular Israelis. Here are his words from a protest rally this past January. More and more often, I meet people, particularly youth, who do not want to live here anymore. For what is happening here is alien to them and is turning them against their will into strangers in their own land. Israel, as it is today, has ceased to be for them a home. These were strong, harsh words. They are hard to hear, but they describe the feelings of many Israelis today. I can't tell you how many. I can tell you I know several personally and have read similar accounting from other writers. And if young Israelis are feeling that disconnect, how much more so young American Jews? American children do not learn in their public schools the stories of the Zionist pioneers, and they don't live with the threats of Hamas and Hezbollah a few miles away. With so much change in just 75 years, with idealism attenuating, and with conflict ever present, is it any surprise that Israel is facing a crisis in leadership? And it is a crisis of leadership. 4 national elections in less than 2 years. The only leader who's been able to hold a government together is Bibi Netanyahu, who has already served over 15 years as prime minister. Most alarming, the current government has been working on judicial reforms that are so divisive, and the opposition has been so intense that many fear the country is in real danger of civil war. Do you know what my great-grandfather, the Rabbi, would say if he could see things now? I knew we should have waited for Mashiach. The prayer I read to you earlier describes only the initial phase of redemption, the ingathering of the exiles. That's not where the hope and the promise ends. Our ancestors did not pray for God to gather us all up and dump us in a parched land to fend for ourselves. The weekday Amidah, the prayer that many Jews recite 3 times a day, every day except Shabbat, over and over, so it is deeply part of who we are as a people, describes the full redemption, and it's multi-part. Bring us out of our land of exile. Install judges and leaders who will channel divine wisdom. Destroy the wicked, uplift the righteous, restore the kingship of David's lineage, and finally, may our eyes see God's own presence return to Zion. When my great-grandfather chose New York over Jerusalem, he was waiting for the Messiah to bring us all back properly. On the brink of the total destruction of European Jewry, my great-grandfather's children decided they could wait no longer. Their generation created with their sweat and blood the miracle of the ingathering of the exiles. Their work was only the beginning. Israel's judges do not yet channel divine wisdom. King David has not returned, the wicked still roam the earth, and the triumph of the righteous is never guaranteed. And I agree with my great aunts and uncles and not with their father. There will be no miracles unless we, the Jewish people, make them through our own efforts. What we are seeing today is the work of miracle making in progress. Israel has no constitution. The political stresses of the moment have exposed an underlying vulnerability, lack of clarity in the role of the judicial system, lack of undergirding for the balances of power, and we are witnessing the pain of healing those weaknesses. I've shared with you today quotes of David Grossman and Daniel Hartman. These 2 Israeli thinkers come from very different perspectives, but they agree about one important thing. Right now is a moment of great potential and hope. Grossman is inspired by the enormous turnout of demonstrators over the past months. He sees in this a reversal of the apathy and the alienation that he'd spoken about in the past. Speaking at another demonstration in April of this year, listen to what he said. It is beautiful and such a change. We, who did not always know the strength of our feeling of belonging to this nation, belonging, caring, mutual obligation, words that suddenly now for us have received firmness of being. We ourselves did not measure the love that was hidden within us for the life we have succeeded in creating here in Israel. Against all the odds, we have created here on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea a nation that is unlike any other in the world. This is the man who'd been speaking for years about how secular Israelis are feeling alienated. Hartman feels differently about the demonstrations. He is asking for all sides to take a deep breath. You should read the interview I quoted from earlier. Hartman makes a really convincing argument that all of this unrest is leading to a weakening of extremism and a return to centrist values, which he believes will be expressed in the next election in 3 years' time. The interviewer asked Hartman what he would say to those American rabbis I talked about at the beginning who have been speaking of the state of Israel as if it is already dead. And here's what Hartman replied. We waited 2,000 freaking years to have this country. Could you wait 3 more years? And could you fight for 3 years? Because if you fight and you stand up and you don't walk away, there are partners in Israel who are looking at you and who feel encouraged by you. We can build it. The moments of greatest fear and loss are also when hope can be sown. The early Zionists believed that fervently. Hartman and Grossman both see it in this moment of upheaval. And as we heard Marcia and Barry read so beautifully during our Haftarah today, the prophet Jeremiah saw it in his time of upheaval too. So I will leave you with those words from Jeremiah. A cry is heard on the heights, Rachel weeping for her children. Thus said Adonai, restrain your voice from weeping, for there is hope for your future. Your children shall return to their land. The children have returned. There is hope for the future, not 1,000 years from now, not in the oblique promise of a Messiah, right now in this moment of upheaval. This is our time to support Israel and make sure that the hope is fulfilled. Can you hear it sown? So may it be your will. Shana Tova.
Yes, Sharkle.